Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Fred Kagan. I'm the director of the Critical Threats Project here at AEI, and it's my great honor and privilege to lead this panel discussing a report which has just been released by my colleague Matt McInnis, The Future of Iran's Security Policy. It's available online at aei.org, and we have these beautiful copies as well if anyone would like one of those. We have a magnificent panel today. We are thrilled to have Lieutenant General Tom Trask, the Vice Commander of Headquarters U.S. Special Operations Command in Washington, D.C., and Vice Admiral retired Mark Fox, formerly Deputy Commanding General of United States Central Command, along with Matt, to talk about the report. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Matt.
Okay. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, General Trask and Admiral Fox and Fred, and for frankly all the team here at AI that's helped put this event together, as well as all the people behind the scenes for the past two plus years that have been working with me on this research. This has been a labor of love for many years, and it's inspired not only by my work here at the Institute, but frankly by my number of years working inside the U.S. government, from my time in the Department of Defense, and particularly my time at U.S. Central Command, serving with these two fine gentlemen, as well as under Generals Petraeus and John Allen, and particularly under Jim Mattis, where we struggled with these issues of how to understand Iran and its behavior, how we can better anticipate what Iran is going to be able to do. And this is what really pushed me when I came here to AEI, to think about how can we do this better. And I think the biggest thing that I ran into when I was engaging in the larger think tank community and the larger academic community is this challenge of getting past Iran as opaque, that Iran is too difficult to understand, as well as the idea that Iran is irrational, what I consider the mad mullah problem, that Iran the Iranian leadership is too crazy, and I think both these ideas really handicap us in being able to understand what Tehran is thinking about, how it looks at the U.S., how it formulates its foreign policies, its security policies, and I think that's really the heart of what I'm trying to do in this monograph, is take the face off that confusion and say, you can understand this, you can learn about it. And so what I'm trying to do is not so much provide a whole bunch of policies, policy prescriptions for this administration or for future administrations, but basically provide analytic frameworks, models, if you will, for understanding how Iran develops its foreign policies, how Iran develops its approaches in particular to security issues, how it goes to war, how it looks at the U.S., how it looks at Israel, how it looks at its rivals in the Persian Gulf, how it looks at threats such as ISIS, and particularly how it develops concepts about military doctrine, how it approaches its defense budget, these big questions. And this is what I want to provide, for the larger community here in Washington and frankly around the world, about ideas of toolkits, things that you can use this to develop better policies, so that if you understand the variables that go into how Iran approaches warfare or how Iran approaches its foreign policy decisions, as things, for example, from Iran's perspective, as the Saudi threat increases from their viewpoint or decreases, or as GDP increases or decreases, how that's going to affect their defense spending, or how that's going to affect their approach to investing in certain capabilities. This is what I want to be able to do with this type of work and provide a better foundation for that. So what are some of the key findings that we did get from this work? Is that fundamentally threat perceptions really does drive Iran's behavior more than anything else. Once they're on a path, they really tend to stick with it. And threat perceptions, it requires a change in threat perceptions to really push them off that path. And fundamentally, the U.S. drives it more than anything else. After that, Israel, and then perhaps, extremist groups like ISIS. After that, maybe the Saudis and other Gulf rivals. But of course, more than anything else, they fear their own people and internal instability. Ideology still matters. And this is, of course, a point of contention at times when people wonder, is the revolution still alive? Does it still matter? And I think it does. And I think what we'll see, and that ideology still is an important point in key aspects of their foreign policy. It drives what I call geopolitical irrationalities in places like its policies towards Israel, it's an overinvestment in places like the Levant, but in other places it behaves more like a normal state. So the question, especially when you're studying things like what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps does and its proxy groups like Lebanese Hezbollah, Shia militia groups, you have to understand the interaction of the ideology plus the more normal geopolitical actors. From a conventional military standpoint, Iran still is very much defensively oriented. And this is where it becomes very frustrating at times for people to deal with this very aggressive, destabilizing Iranian foreign policy that we have through its proxies, combined with a very weak conventional military that is still, I think, fundamentally deterred by the U.S. And it's a reminder that the degree of leverage that we have. 2016 also appears to be a fundamental inflection point, however, where Iran is looking at potentially shifting to a more offensive conventional military. And that's being driven, I believe, by the wars in Syria and Iraq, where Iran is looking that it needs to potentially build a different type of military. And also what I looked at in digging into Iran's defense budget and its approach to acquisition and research and development, that it's what I consider the discretionary defense spending and investment is actually somewhat rational. Especially when you're looking at investments that are not tied to existential fights, like what you have going on in Syria right now. And I think this is actually an important tool for policymakers when they're looking at how we're going to respond to Iran long term after the implementation of the nuclear deal. That you can understand if you know where Iran's GDP growth is going to be, if you have a sense of where oil prices are going, and you understand where Iran's threat perceptions are, whether it's looking at mainly fighting the US and Israel, or it's mainly looking at regional wars against rivals like Saudi Arabia or others, or it's mainly looking at non-state actors like ISIS or al-Qaeda as its main threats, that if you understand these basic variables, you can anticipate where Iran may be needing to put most of its money. When it comes to, is it going to buy new airplanes? Is it going to buy new ships? Is it going to be investing more in its missile program? Is it going to be buying most of its stuff from Russia? Or is it going to try to build most of its stuff indigenously? These really big questions about where to put all those millions after the nuclear deal, which is, of course, an important issue for us right now. I think you can actually understand those broad patterns. And from my own research, Iran tends to spend its money in a fairly rational manner when it's not tied to what I consider those existential fights like you have in Syria. And then finally, I would say that the U.S. has an overwhelming influence on Iran's strategic decision making. And I think this is something that I can't drive home enough. And I think that for the U.S., as we're looking at what to do, I think that we have to remember that Iran has chosen to make us their number one enemy. This is not something that we necessarily, we did not create this situation from our perspective. They chose after the 1979 revolution, from an ideological standpoint, to make us their enemy. And they have created from their strategic thinking, they build their military first and foremost, not only to protect their own regime, to protect them from counter-revolution from their own people, but protect themselves from us. And we still have that degree of influence over their threat perceptions. Any type of war that we go go to with Iran. We control escalation, and we have to remember that. And we can shape the resources that go into their defense industry. There's a whole spectrum of capacity that we have. And I think this is something that in many ways should give us greater confidence in approaching Iran, and that we should not look at Iran as 10 feet tall, and recognize that Iran poses a very significant threat to stability in the region, but we can approach things, I think, with greater confidence and with greater strategy, and frankly, in a smarter way than we have in the past.
Thanks, Matt. General Trask?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Fred, thanks so much for inviting me to be here to represent SOCOM tonight. This is an extremely important topic. I only wish, Matt, that when you and I were working these problems 6, 7 years ago, that somebody had written this monograph then for us to use as a tool, because obviously I'm no Iran expert or a Middle Eastern expert, but I am a military planner. And so from my perspective, tools that we can use to understand our adversaries are critically important to us as we try to provide options for our government and for our secretary going forward. And I think that's what this product does. Anytime you have an opportunity to get into the minds of your adversary and try to understand decision-making processes on their side, it allows you to prioritize your planning in a way that you couldn't do otherwise. And then particularly with Iran, that's particularly important. I took a few specific things away from this as takeaways from a SOCOM perspective, and I will remind everybody that SOCOM is in a support position to CENTCOM for Iran planning, and within the Department of Defense, CENTCOM is in the process of going through another drill at this time on what our way ahead needs to be from a DoD perspective on Iran, and SOCOM certainly contributes to that. One of the things that we bring from SOCOM perspective is a global perspective on several issues. The reach of Iranian networks is certainly one of them, and that's one of the ways that our analysts and our planners can help CENTCOM in that regard. A couple of particular things that jumped out at me as important takeaways, and you kind of hit right off the bat on probably the most important one, and that is that if you understand the mindset of this particular adversary, their activities are going to be predictable and large, and most of the time, you're going to be able to look at this. There is enough body of evidence since the revolution of '79 to prove, I think, that as you point out in the monograph, that their actions are going to be predictable. And the fact that they don't match up to a rationale that we easily understand in the West doesn't mean they're not predictable if you spend enough time understanding the mindset, what the important aspects are to the regime, what they will do anything to fight for, and what are, as you call, conflicts of opportunity versus ones that are conflicts of survival in their minds. And that allows us as planners to develop a list of options for our leadership that are focused on that. The second big takeaway that I had is kind of related to that, and it's the idea of proportionality. And that was something that we struggled with a lot when you and I worked together, because it didn't seem proportional, and it may have been asymmetric, an Iranian response to whatever the issue was, but at least in their mindset, it was proportional most of the time. And I think that's an important thing that we can use in understanding how the United States actions will affect Iranian activities going forward. So that's probably even more important element as far as planners. Now, either way, we have to plan for as many eventualities as possible as military planners. That's going to be standard to anything that we do. And for SOCOM, though, we have to prioritize our planning efforts. We're going to continue to plan primarily against that network of proxies and unconventional warfare that Iran pushes out a way to create that buffer for the regime that you describe in the paper very well. And that's going to be the focus. And I know there's been a lot of discussion on whether increased defense budgets in Iran are going to lead to a greater emphasis on the Artesh and conventional military capability. But I think you hit it right off the bat where you said that Iranians are going to be driven by what they perceive as the threat. More than anything else, probably more than budgetary opportunities or limitations. And so that's the piece that we can still manage the same way, even if they chose to put more money in their defense spending, and particularly on the conventional side. Right now, I think for us, and particularly I think your paper supports the idea that for SOCOM perspective, we're going to stay focused on those proxies and networks and the reach that Iran has well past Syria and Yemen, but into Africa and into South America and into Europe as well. And that's going to, and again, that's part of the nature of my command's charge, to look at these problems from a global perspective. And I think that's going to be kind of one of the key takeaways. The last point I'm making, and it has to do with the last section of your paper on developing an industrial base and whether or not it's even possible for them to really significantly increase the capability of their conventional forces internally, and how much can they depend on getting from others like Russia. And I'll tell you, and particularly the last few years that I've worked in the SOCOM area on our budgets and how we develop our decision-making process on what we buy, that takes a long time to change. You got to really build a significant infrastructure, and right now I tend to agree with your conclusion that that's unlikely to happen. Even though it's possible, and as I said, as military planners, we're going to make sure that Secretary Mattis and the President have options in either case. But our focus right now is going to be with an expectation that they're going to continue to push, and if anything, increased defense dollars in Iran are likely to go toward increasing that network, looking for ways to expand it. We've already seen evidence of them taking units and officers out of the conventional side that are working with the IRGC in Syria, and that may be an indication that they're looking to push on that side. With the defensive nature of their conventional forces, we don't see that being a major change anytime soon. Anyway, I thought that as a tool, the paper is extremely useful. We'll make it mandatory reading in our planners, with our planners down in Tampa going forward. And as I said, I wish we'd had it a few years ago. And I look forward to the discussion and your questions.
Thanks. Mark?
So I approached the Iranian question. First of all, thank you for having me here today. From a former fleet commander's perspective, as Nav sent, I also spent a year in Baghdad back in the 2006-2007 timeframe, and the explosively formed penetrator network and the malign activities that were going on were striking to me at the time. And then in my most recent military assignment as the deputy commander at Central Command. And there's a consistent theme, and in fact, for those of us who have studied this and watched it closely since the '79 revolution, we've seen these spasms of increased tension with decreased tension, kind of an ebb and flow. And from a Western mindset, it seems like it's a very difficult thing to either anticipate or predict. From a Navy perspective, they are very much focused on the asymmetric. They like mines, they like small boats, they like a lot of different small submarines. And so the main thing in my mind as a former fleet commander is, how do you prevent miscalculation? Nobody wants to go to war with Iran. Nobody wants to have miscalculation. How do you prevent that, at the same time not taking the first strike? And so when I was a strike group commander a few years ago, when I was in the Gulf, the then 5th Fleet commander said, okay, I don't want you to take the first punch, and I don't want you to start a war. And so somewhere in this spectrum of potential activities, and people would ask me, how frequently do you interact with the Iranians? And it would be on a daily basis. There's a marked difference between the IRGCN and the IRIN. We've had IRIN regular Navy vessels actually render honors before to U.S. Navy vessels. So there's an entire spectrum, and the vast majority of our interactions, quite frankly, has been routine and professional. And then you'll hear us refer to it as not routine or unprofessional or aggressive or that sort of thing. So in a big spectrum of activities, we watch it closely, but you'll see contradictions in the midst of the run-up to and subsequent to the nuclear deal. Actually, the escalations and some of the activities, some of the malign activities have increased. There's been interdiction of force and flow into Yemen, for example. We're seeing a lot of the coastal defense cruise missiles. So Iran, from my perspective, has always been very much devoted to proxies and to asymmetry, and they are the masters at keeping it just at or just below the boiling point. And so it's a home game for them, and we have rotational forces that come through. And so it's always very important that you get your the commanding officers and the action officers on board ships and in aircraft to make sure that they understand how to handle this situation and to always be in a place where you're prepared. As was previously mentioned, we have a dominating ability to escalate and to control a situation, but at the same time, these are international waters and they're international airspace, and in the case of the Navy, and so they have every bit as much right to be at sea as we do. And so this is something that you watch very carefully. General Mattis, when I was Fifth Fleet, used to always challenge me about, are you the boiled frog? Are you the guy that's been in this hot water long enough where it's now the norm? And so it's something that you make sure that you're not completely cooked, but at the same time, it's something that requires thought and reflection on every day. I thought your piece was really well done, and I too would add to Tom's comments about it would have been really useful to have had some of these thoughts before. The longer you study, the Iranian psychology, I guess is the way to put it. Over the last 5,000 years, it's only been the last 500 that the West has somehow been ascendant, it seems. So that they think of themselves as globe-girdling, striding, powerful people in the heirs of the Medo-Persian Empire. Thanks for having me here today. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. Before I turn it over to the audience, I want to push a little bit on something that I'm hearing generally, which is a sort of a comfort level with the likelihood that the Iranian focus is going to continue to remain asymmetric and probably not go heavily toward developing more conventional military capabilities. The critical threats Iran team and our analyst Marie Donovan, who's worked on this extensively, and a former analyst, Caitlin Pendleton, is here also, worked extensively on some of the Iranian push toward more conventional capabilities, including, I think we could read the deployment of IRGC conventional officers to Syria either way as being a sign of conventional activity or unconventional activity. But there's also the question of at what point does asymmetric activity become symmetric? If you have enough missiles, then they're not asymmetric anymore. If the Iranians were to acquire, say, the Yakhont anti-shipping missile system from the Russians, or the Su-30s that they want to buy from the Russians, at what point does Iran actually cross a threshold here in terms of the kind of threat it poses to the United States and to our allies? Because my last comment would be, I think sometimes we become a little too fixated on the fact that we, the United States of America, can take anything that they can throw at us. But that may or may not be enough, given that our allies in the region can't and may make different calculus. So if any of you want to respond to that.
I'll begin and I'll pass it to Tom. I think your point is well taken, and that is their symmetry is asymmetry. I mean, that's how they've done business all along. And to see the IRGC now in Syria, that's their modus operandi. I think they're going to find a way to try to create the Syrian Hezbollah and the Yemeni Hezbollah and little clones that will follow in the Lebanese Hezbollah model. When you start talking about new technologies, about SSNX-26 or Yakhonts or S-400s or Su-30s, those take money and those take training, and which is another way of saying it's a conventional capability, but it would certainly change your thinking, especially if you talk about air defense and the S-400. So that is part of their layers of trying to prove that they're capable of handling anything that we have. It's a sobering problem when you start thinking about the kind of volume of fire that they could generate. When that makes you a very intensive reader of warnings and indications, And I used to, if you're walking down the street and you're in a really tough neighborhood and it's dark and there are people around you that you don't trust, you're kind of in a little bit of a one stance. If you're happy-go-lucky and somebody just walks up to you and clocks you and you're not ready for it, so it's our job to be the ones that are always ready for whatever may come.
Yeah, I'd look at the idea that we've seen more, as I mentioned, conventional units that are working in Syria, but they're working under IRGC orders and toward their goals. I see that more of an expansion of the proxy network fight than I do an expansion of their conventional capability. It goes back to, I think, and I'm sure Matt can cover this in a little more detail as well, but it kind of goes to your idea that it's really about what they perceive as a threat. So do they perceive a conventional threat to Iran when they look around at their neighbors or even at United States intentions or what they believe them to be? I don't know that they see that as creating a necessity to build a more robust capability. And it's been the focus of their conventional forces have been defensive in the mindset for so long that's kind of what I was talking about. Is it would be so difficult and take a long time to change the mindset of that capability, and it all goes down to what do they perceive as the conventional threat.
No, I think what you see happening in places like Syria, that Iran and the IRGC is facing, a situation where its capacity. This is, I think, Fred, you're pointing to this idea, what we like to call path dependency at times, where you get stuck in the way you've done war for so long, where that asymmetric warfare is not sufficient, and you've seen this slow ratcheting up of what they've been able to do in Syria, and it's not been sufficient. They're not winning in Syria, frankly. Still, after almost we're at 6 years now, past 6 years. And you look at, they've had to depend on Russian close air support to be able, in addition to other Russian capacity, in Syria, and that's still not doing it for them. In Iraq, they're frankly depending on American close air support. And you imagine how humiliating this is, frankly, to the Iranians. The fact that for something that is so vital to from their perceived both geopolitical and frankly ideological interests, at least in Syria. And Iraq is understandable as a buffer that they have a certain geopolitical interest in Iraq. But Syria and Levant is a combination of geopolitical and ideological interests there. For something that's so vital to them, to depend on superpowers to save them. And I can be kind of crude in describing that. It's a very humiliating thing for them. And I think this is something that, and that changing threat perception, but also at a degree of embarrassment, is pushing, I think, these changes that the IRGC itself may have to change. It may have to become something different, or the Artesh may have to become something different with the IRGC. And I think this is the big question, and I think they're struggling with it. I don't think they have figured out the answers to these questions. I think that's why we're seeing them, I think 2016 is an inflection point, because you saw the Supreme Leader talk about these issues. You see him talking about offensive. You see them changing the leadership of their Armed Forces General Staff to kind of bring in new leadership and creating a new structure there to execute these types of campaigns that you see in Syria, because they recognize it's just not working the way they've been doing it in the past. But they don't know how to fix this problem necessarily. You kind of look at our experiences in Iraq, 10 years ago. We had kind of changed our way of doing business. But I think the Iranians, as you pointed out, I think that it's going to be really tough for them. It's going to be very tough for them to do this.
All right, we'll go to the audience. Rules are wait for the microphone to come to you. Identify yourself and your organization and put your statement in the form of a brief question. Over here.
Thank you. I have a very quick question. My name is Saeed Erekat. I'm a Palestinian journalist. At what point, or do you see this administration walking away from the JOACP? And if they don't, and seeing that Iran is adhering completely to its obligation, how would the United States and the other parties that signed the agreement with it not fulfill their own obligations towards Iran? Thank you.
Well, I will try to field that. I think certainly I don't speak for the president or Secretary Mattis or Secretary Tillerson or anyone like that, but I certainly think that the president has expressed, his concerns about the deal, and that there are serious issues with it. It is under, there is a review going on right now about, how the deal may need to be addressed in the future. Obviously there has to be, concerns weighed about other members of the P5+1 and about how any potential strategy is going to be pursued with them or without them in regards to the nuclear deal. But I think the larger issue, I think, for the U.S. is that we need to be looking at Iran from a more strategic approach, that the nuclear deal should be one component of that. I think this has been one of the flaws, frankly, of the previous administration's approach, that they tried to build everything around the nuclear deal and subordinate some of our other policies, whether diplomatic or security, to have everything kind of flow behind in the wake of the nuclear deal. And I think that we should be, in general, looking towards building a more comprehensive approach to Iran, in which the nuclear deal is more a subordinate part of that, and is supporting a larger approach that does address the larger problems that we and our allies have with Iran in the region. But again, I think it's still to be determined exactly how the administration will be approaching the nuclear deal.
I think it's very important to remember that the nuclear deal, as written, not as the Iranians have interpreted it, and not as the previous administration interpreted it, but as written, the nuclear deal gives the United States wide latitude to operate against the proxy network, against the threat network, against the IRGC, for all non-nuclear related activities, including with sanctions and by other means. The United States could take those actions without violating the deal. How the Iranians would react is an interesting question, and that's something that we could talk about, but it's important to understand that the deal itself provides a lot of decisions to an administration even that has decided not to walk away from it. Here.
Kim Dozier, Daily Beast. First question for Matt. Do you think the fact that their campaign hasn't been working in terms of asymmetric warfare, they're having to tweak it, that they're more likely to continue a secret weapons program or be pressured to return to it as soon as possible? And for the general, you mentioned that you're probably going to continue to engage with Iranian proxies. Since you're not fighting them directly, not that I've heard, but be willing to make news for us here, how are you confronting them on the battlefield?
Okay, their efforts inside Syria, they're going to fight as long as it takes in Syria. I think this is actually one of the things I point out in the monograph. At least I try to drive home the point that it was one of our early failures in U.S. policy, in my opinion, and I think in many Western capitals as well, is that we underestimated the degree to which Iran was committed to Assad, and that they will do whatever it takes to support Assad. And I think that's what the lack of understanding that among those in the previous administration and, frankly, again, many other Western capitals, and I may include perhaps even in Israel as well, that that's what undergird the belief that Assad would eventually fall, and especially in 2011 and 2012 during that time frame, which I think helped fuel some bad policy choices for many states during that period, and I think which always surprised me, frankly, during that period. Because if you understood Iran's calculus and Iran's strategic thinking, you would know that there is, frankly, practically almost nothing Iran would do, not do to support Assad. And we've seen that play out. At the same time, Iran takes an approach that's very incremental. towards Syria, that it doesn't do more than it feels like it has to. So every it's a notch. Every year there's a different level, and you see that that they're still not winning, in my opinion. I mean, they may still be able to secure essential needs inside Syria, but it's still not necessarily securing everything that they want. I don't know if that pushes them to the point where they're willing to risk something that would be potentially, that they could be caught, especially with this current administration, that could risk that type of crisis. I think that's a leap for me in calculus, because the nuclear weapons program is tied to a different set of issues, set of variables. And pursuing for the defense of the regime, security of the regime itself, that not completely separate, but I think that is something that I would be surprised if that would be the next leap. I think we would have to be in a much more dire situation where they felt that Lebanese Hezbollah had completely disintegrated, and they felt like they had to do a crash program that they knew was going to risk potential all-out war with Israel and the U.S. I mean, I'm trying to go through that cycle in my head right now. But at the same time, we have yet to be through any kind of period of time when Iran, in the last, say 25 years, at least up until the JCPOA, and frankly during the JCPOA, where Iran has not been cheating at least a little. And so, and Iran is still, despite Iran is, despite the Secretary's, recent statements, and I'm not saying the recent U.S. government statements, there are still, there's still issues that are compliance issues that we still know about, and we still are concerns, and so I think that there are always going to be concerns about Iran doing something illegal, something secret, whether doing something that risky that quickly. That's, again, I'm not quite sure we will go that far that fast at this point.
And Ken, I'll give you just 2 points on your question on how we're dealing with proxies. First, my comments were primarily, as I said, focused on, as a military planner, how we build a list of options that we give decision makers to use. Almost all of them are not direct conflict with Iranian proxies, and so you're right, there's no new news here as far as that story goes. But I will refer you to General Votel in his posture statement, posture hearing this year, talked about that what the real goal is figuring out the best ways, using our analysts and our partners, to minimize the influence that those proxies are having everywhere, not just in Syria, but as far away as Colombian partners in South America, and how they can minimize the influence that those proxies will have in furthering Iranian goals. So he called it, and in his testimony specifically, General Votel talked about, we've got to get in the gray zone that everyone is talking about, and figure out ways to counter that influence in the gray zone, counter messaging, cyber activity, that we can minimize the effect of offensive cyber from Iran as one of the ways to do that. Those were 2 that he mentioned in his testimony this year. But that's really what we're talking about.
Okay. Right over here, ma'am.
Lori Milroy, Kurdistan 24. Given Iran's influence in Baghdad, which has been strengthened as a result of, in some ways, as a result of the war against ISIS and the popular mobilization units that operate, I guess, as Iranian proxies, some of them at least. How do you think that will affect U.S. planning for its presence in Iraq after ISIS is defeated? Would Iranian influence perhaps prevent the United States from maintaining a longer-term presence in Iraq, as people have suggested they would like to see?
Who'd like to field that?
Is that back to me?
You first, man.
Okay. No, I'm quite sure that the Iranian influence with the popular mobilization units is a very serious concern for the administration, as it should be. and it will affect decisions about how we want to maintain posture long-term in Iraq. I know we've had comments from Prime Minister Abadi in the past month or so, about not wanting to have U.S. presence, or at least certain forms of U.S. presence, past the current campaign against ISIS. From my own knowledge and awareness of how these kind of negotiations go on, I would expect some of that is kind of early posturing, and we're going to be going back and forth on this for some time, as we have in the past and in previous iterations. I hope we come up with obviously a better arrangement than has been concluded in some previous rounds of this in the past. But I think that the U.S. has an opportunity in Iraq to strengthen the Iraqi people, to be frankly more self-determinative, because the Iraqi people themselves do not appreciate all the Iranian influence that they have to deal with. And I think this is something that, as much as Iran may have played a role in helping to fight ISIS and defend against the initial invasion in 2014, that ultimately the Iraqi people would like to have frankly more balance in Iraq, and not have this degree of Iranian influence in their security forces, and would like assistance from us and from our Arab partners in building up their security forces and building up political influence there. And I think this is a great opportunity for the U.S. To be able to show that we can be strong, effective partners. And I think addressing the popular mobilization units is precisely where we should be putting a lot of our energy right now. And I think this, because it has a tremendous potential, if we're not paying attention, to really undermine stability there in Iraq long term, reactivate sectarian tensions and conflict, and recreate the environment for the next version of ISIS or a Sunni insurgency there in Iraq.
I'm going to offer an immoderate comment from the moderator. Iraq is more thoroughly integrated into the regional Iranian security system than it has ever been in modern times, or as an independent country. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Iraqis fighting in Syria under the command of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps as part of the Axis of Resistance paramilitary organization in the region. The degree of autonomy that has been granted to the PMUs, including an especially Iranian-controlled, we need to get beyond saying Iranian-backed or Iranian proxy. There are Iranian-controlled organizations in Iraq that are not responsive to the prime minister at an unprecedented level. And some of the leaders of Shia death squads who contributed so much to the sectarian warfare in 2007 are now in prominent ministries within the Iraqi government, which in my view basically dooms the prospect of sectarian stabilization in Iraq as long as that goes on. And so I think that America has been myopically focused on the fight against ISIS to the exclusion of thinking seriously about how to address these problems. And not just the fight against ISIS, but the recapture of Mosul, as if that in itself was going to be the thing that ends the threat from ISIS, which is of course wrong. And as a result of that, we have largely allowed all of this to develop in an extremely passive way, and sort of hoping that it's not going to turn into the sort of problem that I'm pretty sure that it will. And I think this is something that merits quite a lot of attention.
Thank you. That segues into my question. My name is Steven. I'm an independent observer, and I'm not in the mind of the Iranian regime, but if I were them, it would be a no-brainer to get the most bangs for the bucks, and boy, you would get a lot of bangs for all the seed money, the $150 billion that Obama gave them, to destroy and eventually fracture Saudi Arabia. That's the prize. That's the key. Why aren't they doing more to destroy Saudi Arabia in conjunction with the Russians, who certainly have plenty of axes to grind?
Why aren't they doing more to destroy Saudi Arabia?
Well, I will take that question to talk about cost-imposing strategies. Because what you bring up is a good point about what we haven't talked a lot about, which is Yemen and Bahrain and some of the other investments that they do there in their strategies in sponsoring partners and proxies, if we want to call them that, in those places where I think. And General Trask brought this up, which I didn't bring up in my key points, but one of the things I go into about understanding about how Iran decides to use force in different conflicts is discerning the difference between conflicts of opportunity versus conflicts of necessity. And wars, if you understand why Iran's going to go to war, or why Iran's going to throw billions of dollars or millions of dollars at something, you have to understand its calculus, and a big part of that is how much does it matter to Iran? Syria and Iraq matter an awful lot to Iran, whereas Yemen and Bahrain matter quite a bit to Iran, but don't matter in quite the same way. Whereas Yemen and Bahrain matter an awful lot to our partners in the Gulf Cooperation Council and the GCC, and particularly to Saudi Arabia. And so even though Iran has certain strategic interest in both those areas, they have ideological interests in those areas. They obviously have certain religious interests with the Shia populations in those areas that they want to kind of outreach to and build relationships with and influence, kind of missionary work, as I call it. But fundamentally, it doesn't drive their behavior like the existential need that they have to preserve things like Lebanese Hezbollah and Lebanon, and their relationship with Assad, and their need to protect their interests and investments that they have in Iraq. So their investments in Yemen and in Bahrain are cost imposing on the Saudis, in that the Saudis have to, from their perspective, the Saudis feel like they have to respond in those situations. And the Iranians only need to invest a little bit in those places to drive very significant reactions from the Saudis and to a lesser degree the Emiratis and other players. Whereas, when we're looking at how to respond, and this kind of drives those larger questions that I know Secretary Mattis and others in the administration struggle with, and how to prioritize our responses. Whereas in Iraq and Syria, those are things that are existential to Iran. Where, for example, if we're looking just purely from the Iranian strategy perspective, we could, for example, do cost-imposing strategies on Iran there, because those areas are obviously very important to us, but they're much more important to Iran than they are to us. Whereas Yemen and Bahrain are much more, important to Saudi Arabia, and I worry that Iran is doing cost-imposing strategies on Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and other countries there, and potentially on us, as well as we become involved, so that we have to be careful in how we approach those issues. So I think that this is one of the things that I do worry about, and why it's so important to understand how Iran approaches issues like Yemen, vice issues like Syria.
Thank you very much. Raghuveer Goyal, I'm with India Globe in Asia Today. My question is that, do you see any ideology or policy change in Iran from the last two elections? And second, do you see this is a Shia and Sunni war in the region? And finally, if President Trump's recent visit in the region will change any policy change from the US, or bringing peace in the region, or bring the Iranians on the table from the past administration to the new administration? Thanks, sir.
That's 3 questions. I guess I'll keep
3 big ones.
I guess I'll keep, unless you want to take any of these, I'll keep taking them. Going on from the elections, which I figured we would, I guess, at some point talk about the elections. The recent elections that, again, you have to remember the recent elections are within the very limited scope that Iran allows for its democratic expression, if you want to call it that. President Rouhani, as we all like, he is a man of the system. I look at him as someone that is trying to keep this regime, this system going, because he recognizes, and I think the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei agrees with him on this, that there's a lot that's not quite working with the government as it is. And I think that they recognize that certain things need to be tweaked. Now, they disagree on how things need to be changed or tweaked, but I think fundamentally Rouhani is looking for ways to move forward. And even his main competitor, Raisi, who takes, as we like to call it here in the West, the hardliner approach. And I really try to avoid too much of this kind of moderate versus hardliner divisions, because especially on foreign policy, I don't think it really matters too much. But I think that from their perspective, Raisi, maybe was more in line with how the Supreme Leader thinks, but fundamentally, I don't think there's a very significant difference. And I think as I think my colleague here, Maria Donovan, kind of pointed out in one of her pieces, that in reality, that the only way that the Supreme Leader really would lose in this election is if we had another 2009 and people came out on the streets and contested the legitimacy of the entire system. This was an election about legitimacy, and that's what the Supreme Leader, I think, really enjoyed, seeing those long lines, at least what Thomas Erdbrink was able to talk about in the New York Times, about showing those long lines and showing we have these great elections here in Iran. People came out and voted. We are not chaotic like the rest of the Middle East. We are this island of tranquility here in Iran. And I think that story is something that's very important to the Ayatollah to be able to promote. And that's something that no matter who won the election, that was what was important. Now, what's interesting, this kind of goes back to this larger issue about ideology still mattering, is that, that the ideology, I think the average Iranian is not a huge fan of the ideology. We go back and forth of whether on the left, frankly, here in town, kind of thinks the ideology still really doesn't matter. A few people do genuflections to the ideology at the top, but it doesn't really matter. Some on the right kind of talk about maybe it's kind of it's a terminology. One of my good friends describes it as a zombie, a zombie republic at this stage, where it still kind of talks it, but it doesn't really, it's still not alive. I don't know. Maybe it is. But the thing is that the ideology is what keeps this certain elite cohort in power, and they're not ready to give it up yet. And it's what motivates the Revolutionary Guard Corps in their behavior and what they do in the rest of the region. And they're not ready to give that up yet. And we haven't seen any changes in their foreign policy yet. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for changes in the foreign policy, and it's not happening. So I think this is what is for me is essential. And Rouhani, let's remember, has very little influence on foreign policy, at least the core foreign policy. So I think this is for me, I'm not seeing whether Iran comes in from the cold, becomes more integrated into the international system after the nuclear deal, which was kind of the hope, I believe, of the last administration. The arc of history is not going to necessarily bring in this government and change it fundamentally. And so I think this is what I think is a real challenge, that I don't think they're ready for this yet. This is still the founding generation from the revolution. It's still in the Iran-Iraq War. They're still in charge. And I think, frankly, they still have to die before you're going to see a very significant change in leadership. This may even last past Ayatollah Khamenei passing on, because the Revolutionary Guard Corps has so entrenched into the system and their worldview and their perspectives, they still control so much of it, that even if most of the average person doesn't believe it, it's going to be really hard to see that kind of transition. And whether you see this kind of Shia-Sunni dynamic as you're describing, I mean, I think the Iranians don't really want to have great sectarian war. They don't like that. It's not in their ideology, frankly, to do that. The problem is that everywhere they go to work, they tend to work with people that they want to work with everybody, but they end up working in the end with people that they trust, and the people that they end up trusting are fellow Shia. And so that ends up, so every time they go into any country to work with anyone, it ends up creating the sectarian dynamic, even if they don't start that. And that's why you see this cycle repeating over and over again. And I think with this administration, I think there are always, if Iran wants to change, I think there are opportunities to reset. But I think we're not seeing any real changes from Iran in their foreign policies and what they're sponsoring. So I wouldn't expect this administration to take a different attitude about it. All right.
Okay. Last question back here.
Hello, my name is Mehran, and I'm a student from New York. I am fluent in Persian, so I'm going to read one of the Iranian voters in a recent presidential election on Instagram. And then I will ask my question.
Very briefly.
Yes.
Sure. So he said, hello, Mr. Rouhani, I'm going to vote for you, but you should know that I didn't have any other choice. You have never been my choice, but me and all of those who will come and vote for you, it's because we had just one choice and we deserve a better president. So he was actually pretty young, I think in his 20s, kind of at my age. So my question is, in a recent presidential election, we saw a huge turnout from the young people supporting the reformists. So I want to know to what extent in the short-term or long-term goals these young people can pressure on the government or in a democratic ways, such as elections, such as council elections, such as parliamentary candidates to come. Okay. And because Iranian constitution has these three ways for the direct involvement of people. And
so can the youth put pressure on the regime to
change his foreign policy?
Super.
Yeah, thank you.
And one of the, I mean, if you read the monograph, you'll find that I as much as I love the Iranian people, I don't find there's really much you can do from the bottom up to pressure the foreign policy of the Iranian state. Because in the end, I think the supreme leader really does worry about domestic instability. He worries about counter-revolution all the time. The elites are constantly freaked out about counter-revolution. But at the same time, they don't really worry about whether whether the poll numbers are pro or anti-Syria engagement or Iraq involvement or Yemen, unless it gets very, very dire. The only time we've ever seen this happen was towards the end of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when it just became so extreme, where they knew that they were going to have to do something different because mothers and fathers just could not send their sons, and their children, frankly, into the trenches anymore. So I think the domestic opinion has very minimal impact on it, particularly what the IRGC does. And I think that unfortunately, as opposed to how it works in most democracies, Iran is not really a democracy in this sense. It's not. And so I wish it was, but it's not, unfortunately.
If you've taken anything away from this, I hope that you will take away from Matt's project and our discussion here the gravity of the issue, the seriousness of it, and the fact that it is something that we can reasonably undertake to understand. And I would close by echoing Matt's initial point. We have paralyzed ourselves for decades thinking about Iran as an opaque, irrational system governed by crazy mullahs who do things for reasons that no normal human being can understand, and therefore we haven't tried hard enough to understand them. When you try and you look at the body of evidence, as Matt has done so well here, you can discern a lot about what their patterns have been and what their patterns of behavior are likely to be. And this would be a great moment in history for a solid look at that, which Matt has provided, and then a serious look forward about what the United States and its allies can do in the future to think about how to address very predictable threats and challenges that we'll face. I want to thank you all for coming and thank our panelists for a terrific discussion.